Everything in life happens for a reason. Even if it seems like something is wrong, there's a reason for it. I've seen this from my own experience. My wife was a wonderful woman whom I loved very much. We had children, a house, and everything was fine until she started cheating on me. I'll start from there. My story starts when I was a child. I was around 5 or 6 when my folks decided to get a holiday caravan on the south coast near Waith. From then on, every school break, we headed down there for our holidays. Dad couldn't always join us due to his work, so most of the time it was just Mom and the two of us. My sisters and I would often go to stay at the caravan with our dad after a couple of years. We'd invite various friends and relatives to join us for a break from the city. There were also several families from various parts of the country at the caravan on the site when my mom took us there alone without Dad's car to go out in. My sisters and I would explore the site and the local area. We were lucky to have a family car in the 1950s, as not many families had cars back then. Unfortunately, my mother never learned to drive, although she did try to teach herself by practicing on the driving instructors, who she made quite nervous. There were always other children on the site for me to play with, but my sisters considered themselves too mature to play with boys. There were kids on the site for me to play with, but my sisters thought they were too mature for that. My closest friend during those times was Harry, who was a year older than me. We hit it off right away, though I couldn't quite figure out why Harry had a large red birthmark. She had a large red birthmark on her left cheek, which I think is why most other kids avoided her. But it never bothered me. She was a real town boy, but we became good friends during my time there. In fact, if Harry's family didn't go to Waith during any given school holiday, I found the place really quite dull. With Harry being an only child, we felt more like siblings than just friends. My 2 older sisters were rather snobbish when they were younger. As time passed and we grew older, Harry and I gradually lost interest in climbing cliffs and tossing stones into the sea. We'd explored every nook and cranny of our surroundings. We found spots where we could discreetly watch young couples embracing, which was funny when we were 10. We tried to understand why they were doing it. As we got older and learned more about the world, we started to feel uneasy about spying on them. We were so close that we could sense each other's discomfort just by looking at each other. By that time, Harry and I were old enough to take the bus to town by ourselves. We often went to town and harbor. Sometimes, people made insensitive remarks about Harry's appearance, which led to a few there were some disagreements with other kids I knew. I could tell it bothered Harry when people commented on her appearance around the age of 12. She started using makeup to cover up her birthmark. I thought it made it look worse than the birthmark itself, but I never said anything. Harry and I used to go to the dances at the club on the caravan site was our go-to for years. We'd enjoy the children's entertainment in the morning and then dance as the day went on. The dancing sessions were split into age groups, with the younger kids dancing in the afternoon, the older ones in the early evening, and the adults later on as Harry and I grew. As we got older, we joined the sessions for older kids. The bouncers at the club were familiar faces to us and they quickly intervened if anyone ever made a remark about Harry's birthmark. I felt like they were keeping an eye on me, knowing I wouldn't tolerate anyone upsetting Harry. When I was 15, Harry disappeared. My family and I went to Waith before Good Friday, and I went straight to Harry's caravan. When I got there, I found out that it had been sold. The rest of that holiday was the worst I had ever had. My parents took me out every day. Years later, my daddy told me that he'd tried to find out what happened to Harry and her family. It wasn't until much later that he told me that Harry's father had died of influenza during the winter, unable to maintain the caravan. My dad had hoped to find Harry's address so that I could write to her. I never got to exchange addresses with her. Harry and I were friends in the Southwest, but we never thought to keep in touch. All I knew was that she lived somewhere near Bath. Once Harry had left, Waith lost its appeal for me that summer. My mother and sisters went to Waith, but I stayed home with my dad. We visited Waith briefly during his summer break from work, but the rest of the time I hung out with my school friends. The next year, my mother decided it was time for us to catch up with the latest trends. She decided we should go abroad for our summer vacation. I suspect my sisters, who were already seeing boys, started pushing her. We sold the caravan and spent a couple of weeks under the sun. Interestingly, we didn't fly. Instead, we took a train, which took 24 hours. I went with the family on their first trips to Spain and Italy. By the time I turned 18, though, I'd decided to travel with friends instead. I preferred to travel with my friends, so I stopped going with them. Pop festivals were becoming popular at that time, and that's where my friends and I went whenever we had the chance. It was the 60s, and we had a blast for a few years after finishing college. I tried numerous jobs without being able to settle into. By then, I owned a 1959 Human Minx, which I thought of as my own little haven on wheels. One day, when my boss said something disagreeable, though I can't recall exactly what, I told him to shove his job, which had already been tested for ATT. I walked out not long after. While waiting at a red light, I felt a jolt as someone rear-ended me. I got out of my Hillman and was met by a truck driver who was sorry and said sorry a lot. I don't remember exactly what we talked about, but it ended with me following him back to his yard, where his boss said they would pay for a new rear bumper and have it installed the next day. I drove off. I drove my car to the transport yard to get the new bumper installed while I waited in the reception area. Something unexpected occurred. A man appeared at the door and beckoned me to follow him. I didn't ask why, and he directed me to sit in the driver's seat of a truck. I remained silent as he demonstrated the controls and explained the gearbox layout. When he instructed me to exit the yard and turn left, I simply started the engine and followed his directions. I ended up driving the truck for about 30 minutes before returning to the yard. He said, "You've got potential. In my opinion, you're a natural." He left and went back to the office. I followed him, and as we entered the room, the boss I had met the day before emerged from an inner office and addressed the man, saying, "Mitch, didn't I tell you to take that guy for a driving assessment?" "I did." "He'll be fine." "How did you manage that when he's still in my office?" "Well, I was unemployed at the time, so I got the job while the other guy didn't." The next Monday, I was out on the road as a truck driver. I must admit, I really enjoyed it initially. I had no clue what I was doing, but I discovered that I was always good at navigation back then. Drivers looked out for each other, and I owe a lot to those who taught me how to load trucks properly and secure them with ropes and sheets. I loved being on the road. It was the first job I truly enjoyed and settled into quickly. I worked for several companies. My boss was happy to ask me to help out when he needed a truck, which showed he was pleased with my work and that his customers were happy too. I used to go to Marshall's a lot to pick up loads, and there was a girl called Thelma working in the dispatch office. She was the perfect example of what I'm talking about. She dressed to turn heads and get noticed by the guys who were checking her out. Her short skirts and tight blouses showed off her amazing body, and her high heels made her legs look flawless. From the moment I first met Thelma at Marshall's, I could tell she liked to play with people. I'm good with women, but I refuse to be the type who drools over a nice pair of legs or an appealing rear end. I maintained a professional demeanor in my interactions with her, unlike the foolish individuals who chased after her whenever I called Marshall's. It was strictly for business. As time went on, I found myself going to Marshall's more and more. I was doing dispatch work for them, and I got to know a couple of the other drivers there. I have to say, I enjoyed working for them. It felt like we were all part of one big happy family. That's more than can be said for most companies. We had free reign of the place while waiting for our loads, and we could access the canteen whenever we liked. Old Man Marshall prided himself on knowing every member of his 200-strong workforce. Before long, he knew my name and those of the other two drivers from our company who regularly I worked for him, and it was early days when I pulled into our yard one Friday night to refuel and collect my wages. As I stepped into the office, Mr. Wilkins, my boss, emerged and asked, "So, what's on your agenda for tomorrow?" It was a familiar question, usually signaling his requests for me to do a driving job on. On Saturday, there was nothing out of the ordinary. "What's the plan for tomorrow, boss?" I said. "Do you have a decent suit, boss?" "We're going to Marshall's Christmas party." He invites us every year. If we don't go, the old man will be upset. That sounds good, lad. I clean up nicely when necessary. You know that. I'll pick you up at the yard at 6 o'clock. George and Jack are carpooling, but there's plenty of space in my car for you. You can ride with my wife and me. I wondered why George and Jack weren't riding with the boss and his wife in his spacious Jag, which easily accommodated 5, but I kept quiet. The next day, I felt a bit out of place, like a dressed-up turkey on the road. I hadn't needed to wear any of my suits. I hopped into my boss's car for the ride to Marshall's factory, where the event was happening in the huge canteen. Mr. Wilkins insisted that I call him Bill for the evening, but I knew that come Monday it would be back to boss again. I got into my boss's car for the ride to Marshall's factory, where the event was happening in the huge canteen. Mr. Wilkins insisted that I call him Bill for the evening, but I knew that by Monday it would be back to boss again. He introduced me to his lovely wife, and I couldn't help but wonder how he managed to snag such a catch. Money was probably the answer, but let's not dwell on that as it's not relevant. When I got to Marshall's, George and Jack and their wives joined us. I realized that I hadn't been told they were coming. I could bring a guest, but I didn't have anyone in mind. If wives were invited, surely girlfriends would be too. I put it down to an oversight by Bill Wilkins. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins were there. We found our seats at the head table, next to Old Man Marshall, his wife, and all his directors. I figured the other executives from some of the other firms that contracted with him would be at the other tables. We looked around for our assigned seats. There was a bit of concern when we found seats designated for Jack, George, and their wives, but I couldn't find mine nearby. I wandered for a while. I started to think that I hadn't been invited. If I couldn't find my seat, I was going to go outside and wait until after the meal. But then Thelma tapped me on the shoulder and told me to go to my seat, which was next to hers. I'm not as foolish as I may seem. Thelma was sitting in the spot where my escort would have been seated if I had been told I could bring one. This meant that I was sitting in the spot where her escort should have been. I got the distinct impression that I had been set up. Old Man Marshall circulated among the guests while we waited for everyone to settle in. When he reached me, he thanked me for coming and for doing such a great job for him. Then he said, "Well, my boy, our lovely Thma here. I didn't have an escort for this evening, so I asked if I could look after her for him." I reassured him that I would, but I couldn't help but wonder why charming Thelma hadn't managed to secure a date that evening. The meal was catered by an outside service, as all the cafeteria staff had been invited. Some of them sat at our table, meticulously observing every move and dish served by the caterers. It seemed like no meal had ever been inspected so closely. After the meal, there were seemingly endless speeches. Then the tables were pushed aside and a band began to play. The music was generic, designed to appeal to the diverse age range of the staff, spanning from 16 to 60. Thelma and I danced together, but a few guys approached and asked her to dance as well. By around 10:30, I had probably had a few more of the free drinks than I should have while dancing to a slow song with Thelma, which I found quite stimulating. I couldn't resist asking her why she hadn't managed to find a date for the evening. Thelma giggled, indicating that she too might have had a bit too much to drink. "Don't be ridiculous. I could have easily found other guys who would have been eager to join, but I chose to spend the evening with you. Why do you want to know? I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you were interesting. In fact, I'm intrigued." "Why is that?" "Well, you're different." I must have looked puzzled, so she clarified, "Come on, you know what I mean. You don't pursue me like the other guys do. I'm curious why you don't find me attractive, or perhaps you're interested in men." "Thelma, no, I'm definitely of a traditional orientation and I do find you very attractive." "Ah, so you have a steady girlfriend then?" "No, actually I don't at the moment." "Then why have you?" "I haven't asked you out, and I haven't done anything to offend you, have I?" "On the contrary, Thelma, you're a lovely young woman." "You're what, 18, 19, no, 19. Thelma confirmed that I'm 24. I'm constantly on the road for 5 days a week, often spending several nights away. I desire a stable relationship, but please don't take this personally. I'm seeking a partner who's okay with me returning home on Friday nights and simply going to the pub for a drink. I'm looking for someone who won't be out with other men when I'm away, but if you are looking for something a bit different tonight, you've got it. I don't think you're ready to settle down yet, though. You enjoy the attention too much when men pursue you. Is that right? Yes, I think so. You're not upset, are you? Maybe a little disappointed? I'd at least like to steal a kiss under the mistletoe tonight. That would be my pleasure. It seemed like Thelma had something to demonstrate after every dance. We ended up beneath that cursed mistletoe around 1 a.m. It was 12 a.m. when George approached and told me that Mr. Wilkins was ready to leave. I said goodnight to Thelma with a kiss and accompanied her to the car. As the car left the parking lot, I glanced back and saw another man approach her and put his arm around her. The next week, I had a different job, so I didn't go to Marshall's. The week after that, I didn't go either. They closed for Christmas, and my boss made me work on the day after Boxing Day for a special task that took me to Aberdeen over the New Year holiday. Back then, oil exploration in the North Sea had just begun, and I had to transport urgently needed research equipment there. The weather was awful, and I spent nearly 2 weeks waiting. I was at the harbor waiting for the ship to arrive so I could unload the gear. I enjoyed myself in the pubs there. There's nowhere better to celebrate New Year's Eve than Scotland, even if the weather is terrible. However, by the time the ship I was waiting for finally showed up, the novelty had worn off. It turned out the ship had sought shelter from the storm in another port along the coast and nobody thought to inform me to meet them there. There was a storm in another port along the coast, but nobody thought to tell me to meet them there. I was just a humble truck driver, after all. When I returned to the southern region, I decided to take a couple of days off to make up for being away during the New Year period. I won't say the boss approved, but he was aware of my tendency to speak my mind. I was thinking about my bosses if I felt AG was being unfairly treated. There were plenty of driving jobs available at the time for those who knew what they were doing. On Wednesday morning, I parked at Marshall's loading bay and went into the dispatch office. I was surprised to see a woman I barely recognized sitting in the chair. She was wearing a loose-fitting jumper and slacks with her hair tied back in a ponytail. As soon as she saw me, she tied her hair back in a ponytail and rushed over to me before I could say anything. She gave me a big hug and kissed me. I was like, "What are you doing? I thought you were going to smother me." When she finally let me go, I asked her, "What's up?" "I missed you." "Do I meet your standards now?" "Thelma, I'm not sure what to say. Tell me if you still see me as some sort of promiscuous girl who flips from one guy to another every night." "I never said that, but you insinuated it, so I want to know if I'm still acceptable as your girl." "Of course you always have been, but I want to be sure. So I'll expect you to pick me up on Friday night. Here's my address and I've arranged for you to finish early on Friday. You've got a lot on today and tomorrow, so you better get going." What could I possibly say or do that wouldn't upset her? So, like a sheep to the slaughter, I kissed her and returned to the loading base to load my truck on Friday evening. I arrived at her house around 7, I picked her up at 00. She came out of the house with an overnight bag. I asked, feeling a bit nervous, why she needed the bag. She said that since I wanted to go to the local pub, which is about 35 miles away, I could stay over at her place instead. That way, I wouldn't have to drive back and forth all weekend to pick her up and drop her off. So Thelma ended up staying over at my parents' house that weekend. Not in my bed, but in my sister's. Both of whom were married and no longer living at home. Thelma slept in their old room the next weekend. I stayed at her parents' house and we explored the pubs in her neighborhood. Her parents were welcoming. I got along well with her father and younger brother initially. I wasn't sure how her mother felt about me, but she eventually came around. You know what? Thelma had me completely wrapped around her finger. From that first weekend onward, she never wore anything suggestive at work or elsewhere, at least as far as I knew. When we were together, she dressed to the nines. It didn't take long to realize that Thelma wasn't a virgin, though I never assumed she was. I also learned that she couldn't take birth control pills. They didn't agree with her, so we didn't make love very often. 3 months later, we found ourselves engaged. Before I realized it, we had placed a deposit on a rundown old house situated almost exactly halfway between our parents' residences. We dedicated all our spare time over the next year to practically rebuilding the place, bringing it up to modern standards. Once the house was complete, the natural progression was to tie the knot. We did just that, and our reception took place in Marshall's canteen, with the C staff handling the catering. The catering guy, Marshall, was there to express his pleasure at seeing us together. I've never been entirely sure of his involvement in Thelma's plan to reunite us. Maybe Thelma just manipulated him, as I later discovered she did with many others. Life was blissful for the following years. Thelma became pregnant fairly soon after our wedding. We mostly used condoms, but being newlyweds, things occasionally got a bit hectic, as you can imagine, after having our first. We had our second child, Helen, and decided that 2 kids would be enough for us. Thelma arranged for a permanent birth control solution. However, during Helen's pregnancy, she had some complications that the doctors were concerned about, which led to her being hospitalized and monitored closely. While Thelma was still pregnant with Tracy, I received a call from Mr. Marshall. His transport manager was retiring, and he needed someone to take over the role temporarily. This left him in a tricky situation with Fawn's maternity leave. He'd already approached Bill Wilkins and now asked me to step in as the interim transport manager until Thelma returned to work. I agreed, as it was handy to be nearby when Fawn gave birth, rather than traveling all over the country while she nursed. I was happy to do it, but it became a permanent position when Thelma and I decided to have another child. It was a long-term commitment. The job wasn't difficult, it just required knowledge of vehicles and an ability to plan truck routes over time. I enjoyed it, but not as much as being out on the road. The pay was better, and there was no overtime required. I was happy to have the chance to spend time with our 2 young children. I couldn't shake the feeling that they might inherit their mother's assertiveness as they grew older, despite anticipating some challenges ahead. I decided to deal with them as they arose. Life continued much like it does for many couples with young kids. I was genuinely content with my lot, a good job, a comfortable home, a loving spouse and 2 delightful daughters. But life is full of surprises. If I were to pinpoint the beginning of my suspicions that something was amiss, I'd say it was when Tracy had just turned 6. One morning while driving to work, I noticed a car behind me. It's normal to have other vehicles on the road. I want you to keep in mind that I've been working as a truck driver for a while. When you spend all day behind the wheel of a truck, especially if you're skilled at your job, you develop a keen awareness of your surroundings. There's always the possibility that the car behind you might be carrying some troublemakers who want to steal your cargo, especially if it's valuable. Or it could be one of those dreaded unmarked police cars, which can be. It can be a real headache for drivers trying to stick to a night schedule, so if you know what you're doing, you keep an eye on the cars behind you. Every driver should do that as a matter of course, but what I'm talking about is paying attention to the specific car and its occupants. You can usually spot them from a mile away if you're alert enough. The car I noticed behind me wasn't budging at every junction. If it fell behind, it would speed up and overtake everything until it was right back on my tail. It definitely wasn't a police car. They drive much more skillfully than this guy, but it was clear that he was following me that evening. I noticed another car tailing me as I left work. It was driven by a woman, but she followed me all the way home. The next morning, the same guy was there again. In the evening, the woman followed me to the pub on Thursday nights. I usually have a drink, just one since I'm driving, and play a game of snooker with some of my staff. We hadn't been at the pub long when I saw her come in, and not long after that the guy came in too. They went to the bar separately and got their own drinks. Then things took a turn that I can only describe as absurd. While I was playing snooker, this woman was at the bar showing off as much as she could and staring at me so intensely that I could feel her eyes boring into my back a few times during my game. Her eyes met and she smiled at me. The only thing I couldn't figure out was who and why someone was trying to set me up, but I had no idea. I wasn't going to be taken for a fool. I knew what they were up to. I understood the reason behind the why question. Old Man Marshall was the epitome of family values. He ran his company like one big family. I was an outsider who'd married one of Marshall's favorite employees. I quickly earned favor with rumors that I was destined for advancement under Marshall's wing. I suspected jealousy or I think someone was trying to manipulate me into doing something that could jeopardize my marriage and reputation with Marshall. I wasn't sure who was behind it, so I ordered another drink and slipped out the back door unnoticed while heading to the restroom. I did think about turning the tables on them, but I wasn't sure who I could confide in. I decided to drive home, thinking about how long they might have waited for me to come back from the restroom the next morning. The man reappeared, but this time I ignored him. Later that evening as I left Marshall's yard, the woman started following me. I decided to take her on a detour through a familiar industrial estate where I knew the layout well from my truck driving days. Eventually, we reached a dead end after parking. I slipped away from her line of sight between the buildings and circled around. I followed her until I was behind her car, which I suddenly appeared by her car door. She was caught off guard and realized I was onto her. She quickly reversed the car at high speed and disappeared in moments. I was frustrated with myself for letting her escape. I returned to my car and headed home for a while. I thought that was the end of it. They seemed to have stopped following me, perhaps giving up once they realized I was aware of them. 2 weeks later, upon my arrival at the pub on Thursday night, a different woman was at the bar when I got my drink. At first, I didn't think she was the same woman I'd seen before. But then she came over to the jukebox while I was picking songs and she said, "Get lost, lady, and tell your pals I'm not as naive as I seem." So I told her, and I told the PR guy from Granada that if I ever see him again, I'll give him a piece of my mind. The woman was taken aback. She seemed quite shocked and left the pub right away. When I got to the parking lot, I saw a Ford Granada, but there was no driver around. About a month later, Thelma came limping in on her high heels, having broken a bone in her ankle. She was in a real state, calling me frantically from the hospital to ask me to pick up the girls. When I got there, the doctor told me that although the fracture wasn't severe, it needed to be kept still with plaster. But there was a hiccup. Thelma's ankle had swollen up, so we had to wait until it went down before putting on the plaster. So I had to take a few days off to care for the girls as it was the school summer break. It was a nice change for me to be both parents for a while, even though they found my cooking attempts pretty funny. I know they had a blast teasing me. Cooking isn't my forte. I found it hard to get everything ready at the same time, as I was doing it all at once. That evening, the phone rang. I couldn't answer it myself, so I asked Tracy to take a message at 6 o'clock. I figured she was capable after all. We'd coached her on what to do and say. Oops. Sorry, Uncle Frank. Mommy's at the hospital. She hurt her leg. Daddy's taking care of us. Tracy hung up. Who was that? I asked. Uncle Frank, she replied casually. Who on earth was Uncle Frank? I asked. I'd never heard of him before, she said. I could investigate further, I replied, but Helen called Tracy from the other room, distracting her. I followed Tracy, but for some reason I hesitated to enter the playroom. You're going to get into trouble with Mom. You broke your promise to Mom that you wouldn't tell Dad about Uncle Frank. What did I just hear? I thought. Then I called Tracy. She said, I didn't tell Dad about Uncle Frank. Then there was the usual back and forth, you did. I didn't. I decided not to get into it. Both girls were involved. It seemed like they knew I wasn't supposed to know about Uncle Frank, and if I jumped into the conversation, they'd be on guard. It seemed wiser to let it be and wait until they were more relaxed. Yeah, I was troubled. I couldn't fathom why Thelma would want to keep some man a secret from me. Could it be that was a question I truly didn't want to entertain? Perhaps denial was preventing me from considering such thoughts. My ankle was still swollen overnight, which was contrary to what the doctor had said. It seemed even more swollen than it had been the day before, when the nurse had mentioned that it could take up to a week to reduce. I realized that I needed help at home before the girls fell ill or showed signs of malnutrition from avoiding my cooking. My sister offered to stay and help out with the girls, which meant I could spend some time at the office. Sarah brought her 99-year-my other daughter, Marcy, and I didn't hit it off. She seemed to take after her mother, who, despite being my sister, wasn't one of my favorite people when we were younger. However, our relationship had improved as we got older. I'm not entirely sure of my motives. Perhaps I needed someone to confide in, so I ended up sharing about Uncle Frank with Sarah. It's possible that my daughters were warned. I don't know if Thelma told anyone else, but she did tell Sarah. Sarah thought for a moment and then said, "Do you think that's why you resented Jenny and me when we were young? We never told you anything when we were younger." It's a possibility, but I won't tolerate my wife keeping secrets from me, especially not about. I can understand why other men are interested in Thelma. I've always wondered how you won her over. The truth is, Sarah, I didn't pursue her. It was the other way around. She certainly had enough for quality. I'll concede that much. What's your agenda here? Do you want me to ask the girls about this? I figured they might be more willing to confide in you. I distinctly recall Helen. If they tell me, they can say they're not betraying your trust. I'll see what I can find out. Thanks, sis. Just don't make it too obvious. I left Sarah with the kids and went to work in the afternoon. I visited Thelma at the hospital. I went to the hospital where Thelma said Sarah had spent about an hour with the girls earlier that day. I felt like I had to ask Thelma if there was something on her mind. She said there were a lot of unpaid bills and household tasks. Later that night, after Sarah had tucked the children in bed, she sat me down at the kitchen table. She looked stern. "I don't know who Frank is, but I think you should find out what's going on. Have you asked the girls about him? What did they say?" "Don't be silly. I've asked Marcy to look into it. I thought the girls wouldn't recognize her as an adult, and you know how kids are about this Frank guy. Apparently, Thelma used to chat with him outside the school while waiting for the girls to be the girls say he's divorced and his kids go to their school. They say it's his only chance to see them since he doesn't live with his wife, who has custody and makes it hard for him to visit. He said he was watching them in the school playground, but why didn't he tell me?" Marcy isn't naive, she asked that question too. "I heard that Frank's wife works at your company, and there's a rumor that you might tell her he's monitoring the children at the school. I see what you mean, but surely Thelma doesn't believe I would report the guy to his wife. That story is nonsense. Think about it, if Frank really was at the school when the kids were leaving, why wouldn't his supposed ex-wife see him there?" I sent Marcy to ask a few more questions and my wife saw him there. I got really concerned because neither of your daughters knows who Frank's kids are. It's a small school, so it doesn't add up. Plus, apparently, sometimes when Thelma takes the girls to the park after school, Frank is there too. What's even more suspicious is that he's been spotted at the park during school holidays. He's been seen with Thelma and the girls at the shopping center on more than one occasion. He buys the kids ice cream, candy, and burgers. This is a serious issue that needs to be resolved as soon as possible. It's possible that Thelma was planning to meet Frank the other day when she had her accident. Maybe that's why he called her to ask why she never showed up. What do you think? I think they're having an affair. I don't know how to prove it, but something fishy is going on. We need to find out what it is. I'm relieved you're on the same page because I'm starting to feel lost. Let's not jump to conclusions. There might be a perfectly innocent explanation we're overlooking, though. Honestly, I doubt it. Think back, brother. Can you recall anything? Has Thelma done or said anything recently that might be significant? Anything unusual or out of character? Well, not from Thelma directly, but something odd did occur the other week. I proceeded to recount the incident of being followed and approached by the two girls at the pub, which I could only interpret as them trying to flirt with me. Sarah was just as puzzled by that. The next day, Thelma's ankle was looking better. The nurses said she was recovering well and might be able to go home by the weekend. That evening, Sarah, who had been anxious since I arrived, she was keen to have a word in private as soon as we were out of earshot. She didn't waste any time asking what color the car was that followed you. It was a maroon Ford Granada. Why do you ask? Well, it was pretty close to what the girls said it was, dark red. I think it was Frank who followed you. And there's some worrying news. Marcy thinks the girls might have been in that car. She gave me a detailed description of the interior, including the size, the plushness of the seats and how they couldn't open the doors from the inside because of child safety locks. I agree that only someone who'd been inside the vehicle would know that. So today I called Wilkins, who's got connections in the police force, and he's trying to. It was a smart move to get the license plate numbers of the cars that were following me. You probably owe Marcy a lot for all the work she's been doing with the girls. I know I'm lucky she's as clever as her mother. I'm not sure if I should take that as a compliment or not. Sarah replied with a smile on Friday morning. Bill Wilkins called me at the office bright and early. He told me that the Granada was owned by Frank Williams, who had a reputation with the police. The other 2 cars had been rented from a budget car rental agency. Interestingly, one of them hadn't been brought back, and the renter, a man, had used fake documents to rent both vehicles. That afternoon, after making a few phone calls, I went to the hospital to pick up Thelma. I had a quick chat with the nurse I'd been in touch with all week. Thelma realized I was there after I asked her a few questions. She told me that a man had been visiting her every afternoon after I left. It seemed a bit odd because he never brought anything for Thelma. Most people usually bring something, even if it's just a greeting card. I suspected that our Frank Williams wouldn't want to leave any evidence that might arouse my curiosity. Men like Frank Williams are pretty clever when they're up to something, but if he thought he could get away with what I suspected he was planning, he had another thing coming. That evening, when we arrived, he found out differently. When Thelma arrived home, she was surprised to find the children weren't at the door to greet her. She was on her crutches, so she asked me where they were. I told her I'd sent them to my parents' place for a few days, thinking it would give her some time to sort things out. Oh, that wasn't necessary, Thelma replied, settling herself on the sofa in the lounge. I would have preferred if they were here. I think it was necessary. Thelma, we have a lot to sort out in the next couple of days. I don't want the girls to get upset unnecessarily. What things? Thelma asked. Oh, Sarah, you're still here. You didn't need to stay. I'm sure I can take care of myself and the children. I can manage on my ankle now that it's in plaster. I'm not here for you, Thelma. I'm here for my brother. Sarah's voice was dripping with venom. Thelma's face drained of color, and she turned to me. What's going on here? I was going to ask you exactly what's going on between you and Frank Williams. I've made my mind up. I'm afraid you figured it out, haven't you? It was bound to happen eventually. I'm sorry, but I've developed feelings for someone else. I didn't plan on telling you yet, but I'm going to file for divorce and marry Frank just like that. I've been struggling to find the right way to break it to you for weeks now. I didn't want to cause you more pain. Then Sarah started to speak, but the sound of movement behind her interrupted. That's all I needed to hear. I could start the process now. I'll be in touch. A voice from the hallway said, and then we heard the front door close. I exchanged a smile with Sarah before turning back to Thelma. It sounds like you were quite considerate, but it's just a fabrication. Did you persuade Frankie to set me up? What was the plan? Was it supposed that I would be seduced by one of his familiar girlfriends, which would lead to a divorce that would be convenient for you? I guess you thought that I'd be obliged to pay you. All right, I guess I should have seen this coming. My ex-wife was quite charming, but I didn't fall for your scheme. The idea was clever. You wanted to leave me with my stable job and shack up with an unemployed jerk, expecting me to support you in your new life. I have no idea what you're. If you're not sure what's going on, you should ask your oddball boyfriend. Here's what's happening. You have until Monday to remove all your belongings from my house. My lawyer is drafting the divorce papers right now, and you'll be able to sign them on Monday. To do that, you'll need to leave the house. I'll need it for the children. Oh no, darling, that's not going to happen. You and your strange boyfriend won't be anywhere near my children. I might allow you to visit them if either a social worker or I'm present. Actually, social services will be seeking I got a court order tonight. What do you mean they can't do that? Oh, but they can, darling. I've always found social workers to be a nuisance, but once they learned about Frank Williams and what you were planning, they've been very cooperative. You won't be allowed near the children anymore. I also think the police will want to speak with you. I don't understand why. What did the police want to know? Oh, you silly woman. Sarah interrupted, eager to share her thoughts. I let her continue. What did you think Williams was doing hanging around the school? This man has a long criminal history. He wasn't after you, he was after your daughters. Thelma's expression was priceless. She looked at me and then at Sarah. You're not telling the truth. Frank wouldn't act like that. Oh, really? Where do you think he's been for the last 7 years? He's been working abroad for the last 7 years, probably in the Far East. It's more like the Isle of Wight. Parker's prison is located there. It can be conditionally called abroad anyway. As soon as the police finished questioning him and my children, we'll find out if he harmed them. But let me warn you, if this scoundrel harms my children, I will do my best to punish both of you without involving the police. Sarah had to call an ambulance because Thelma suddenly fainted. We couldn't bring her to her senses. It must have been either her father or her brother who picked her up from the hospital because I definitely didn't see her again until we finalized the divorce paperwork. Thelma realized there was little point in seeking custody of the children because social services still had the order against her stating that she had endangered the girls. It came out that Thelma had left the children with Williams on several occasions while she was at the hairdresser and similar places. However, the specialist who interviewed my daughters told me that nothing had happened. They believed Williams was still in what they called the grooming stage. He was careful not to scare them off by moving too quickly. The police hadn't charged Williams with any crimes, but they were confident he'd stolen the rented car and hadn't used it for its intended purpose before things fell apart. When they inquired out of curiosity why, the police inspector glanced at me and said, "Well, it's possible you've been lucky, even if things have been tough." The last woman Williams seduced and then exploited was a widow. Her husband. The woman died in an unsolved hit-and-run accident. The issue is that we can't prove what Williams intended to do with the car. But we can speculate that if he remains in this area, we'll be keeping a very close watch on him. Not overly close, though. I hope. The officer scanned the area to ensure no one else was there. I could overhear. Oh, I wouldn't worry too much about that, sir. As long as nobody ends up dead, you'd be surprised how long it takes for the officers assigned to watch him to take a restroom break. Of course, I never mentioned that to you. Make sure you have a solid alibi. There are plenty of this means that people who believe individuals like Williams are simply mentally unwell and deserving of sympathy. Personally, I think that if you were subjected to the harsh punishment that we usually have in prisons, it would be too lenient. He's a sly and wicked person. Don't be too harsh on your wife. Will Williams is adept at he's very good at manipulating people. If you'd seen him in that interrogation room, you wouldn't have believed how innocent he seemed. She never had a chance once he set his sights on her. It wasn't until we let her read Williams' file that she truly grasped the extent of his depravity. Looking back, I realized I might have narrowly. Williams was clearly preparing for any possible outcome, but knowing what that despicable person had planned for my family, I was resolved not to ignore his actions. However, I could afford to bide my time until things came down over the next few years, as everything remained uncertain. Thelma wasn't permitted to see that she couldn't take the kids out by herself, which was frustrating for them and their mom. Based on what the police and others said, it seemed like she had no chance against Williams. I believe she wouldn't have tolerated him abusing our girls if she'd known about it. I have to hold on to that belief for my own sanity. After about a year, I asked social services to relax the conditions for Thelma's visits with the kids, and they agreed. After about a year, I asked social services to relax the conditions for Thelma's visits with the children, and they agreed since the children were never placed in care. I ultimately had the final say, and Thelma mentioned a few times that she wanted us to reconcile, but I made it clear that it wasn't going to happen, knowing that William's car was parked outside. I used to sit outside on some days while the children were at school. The neighbors said I couldn't believe they were just having Bible readings, but who knows? There's a lot to learn from the Bible. I advised Ma to look for another partner, which she eventually did. He seemed like a decent guy, although a little stubborn. He proposed to Thelma, but she refused until she could tell him everything. As far as I know, he listened to her explanation and then suddenly left without saying a word. 2 weeks later, Thelma deliberately crashed into Williams with her car outside the local police station. She noticed him hiding near another nearby school. Thelma called the police. The police were called, and Williams was taken in for questioning. However, she waited outside the station until he was released and then drove her car into him as he walked along the pavement. After that, she reportedly drove to the river and jumped into the water. I'm not entirely sure that was her true intention. Thelma is quite adept at getting what she wants. She's good at manipulating people. I heard that there was a police car right behind her after she was initially charged with manslaughter. Thelma's legal troubles were eventually resolved when the charges were dropped due to her unstable mental condition, which made her unfit to stand trial. She was placed under the care of a local psychiatric hospital. She was sent to the hospital, where it was determined that she posed no threat to the public. After about a month, she was released. She continued to attend therapy sessions regularly, and social services kept a close eye on her interactions with the children. Meanwhile, Sarah's husband Ralph started working on the oil rigs in the North Sea. Consequently, Sarah and her family basically moved in with me to help out with the girls and manage Thelma's occasional visits. Over time, though, the visits got less and less, and it felt like years since I'd last spoken to her. I think it was just before Ellen turned 10 that one evening, Sarah, Ralph, and I were in the kitchen. We were chatting about our childhood, and naturally we got talking about Sarah and my summer in Weymouth. Ralph suggested we all go to Fortnite there that summer, and Sarah was really keen. Before Ralph and I had a chance to think about it, she'd invited Jenny and her family to join us. We rented 3 caravans next to each other it was the same site where our family used to stay when we were kids. The children had a great time at the beach and were really excited when we showed them all the places where we used to play. We even ran into a few locals we knew from our childhood. One morning, I took my 2 daughters for a stroll along the cliffs. A lot had changed. The erosion of the muddy cliff faces by the sea made it tricky to find the tree where Harry and I used to carve our initials every year. Some were still visible, including H and H1 1959. Tracy asked, "I wonder who they were and where they are now." I replied, "You're joking, Dad." Tracy said, "Then who was H?" "She was just a friend." "What do you mean? Was she your childhood sweetheart?" I hadn't anticipated the situation I got myself into. I guess she sort of was. I used to spend many enjoyable holidays here with her when I was your age, but I'm not sure if you could really call her my. Tracy asked, sounding genuinely curious, if it had been good. I replied that it had been lovely. I would have liked to kiss her more, but she didn't return the next year. "Oh, that's sad. Were you very upset?" "Yes, I was. But let's talk about something else." We changed the subject for the rest of the holiday. Wherever we went, my 2 daughters would ask if I had been there with Harry. Sarah and Jenny caught on pretty quickly and would answer Tracy before I could downplay it or claim not to remember. The cakes and other treats made by Sarah and Jenny ended up with markings that looked remarkably similar to H and H. I tried to show my disapproval. But they all started laughing and I couldn't help but join in after we got back from the holiday. Things took a turn for the worse at Tracy and Helen's insistence. My parents found old holiday photos of Harry and me from when we were kids and showed them to my daughters. I have to give credit to my girls, Despite Harry's, there was a prominent birthmark in many of the photos, but my sisters never mentioned it or asked about it. I'm not sure if they instructed the girls not to, but it was never brought up. The next year, we visited Waith again, but it was just me, my daughters, Sarah, and Marcy. Ralph was supposed to join us, but he backed out at the last minute, citing a work-related issue. On a related note, I was surprised at how calmly Sarah took it, given that he spent so much time away on the rages. We managed to fit everyone into my car, including the luggage on the roof, for the trip to Waith. The initial days were pleasant as we settled in. However, during breakfast on Tuesday morning, my daughter suddenly expressed a desire to revisit the tree with carvings on its trunk. It was around 10. At 10 o'clock we started our mission. The girls were particularly lively that morning, singing and dancing without any apparent reason. When we reached the tree, Tracy ran up to it, shouting, "Yes, yes, he's done it, he's done it." The girls gathered around the tree excitedly as Sarah and I approached. They stepped back beneath the 1959 carving, and there was another inscription, H and H1 1982. I looked at it for a moment, trying to. Ralph suddenly appeared from the bushes with two unfamiliar children. She said, "You'll know where to find her. She also told me to tell you that she's where you used to see the couples courting. She wants to meet you privately." I don't remember stopping to speak to Ralph. I just ran off towards our old hiding spot, but when I got there, Harry wasn't there. I was disappointed and confused. I turned back. I hadn't gone far when Harry suddenly leaped out at me. It was like a childhood game we used to play. "Jesus, Harry, you scared the living daylights out of me," I managed to say. "Well, it's a change for me, being the one who's startled," she replied. Then we fell into our old habit of talking like we did as kids. When we returned to the tree, the others were gone. Harry and I made our way back to the caravan I shared. Harry told me that after her father died, her mother couldn't afford to keep the caravan and sold it. She regretted not seeing me as much as I regretted not seeing her. Eventually, her mother remarried a kind man who paid a lot of money to have her birthmark removed with an early laser technique. It wasn't entirely successful, but it boosted her self-esteem. She then said something that took me by surprise. She mentioned that only one other thing had boosted her self-esteem. She said that I was the only child she'd ever met who never commented on or asked about her birthmark. Then Harry told me she'd married a soldier and had 2 kids with him. Sadly, he died in a training accident in 1978. Since then, she'd been living with her stepdad, as her mom had passed away from a stroke a few years back. Ralph somehow found out about her, and then Sarah told me. He told me that he had a lot of colleagues on his oil rig who lived near the Bath area. He asked around and someone remembered the girl with the boy's name and a birthmark on her face. He went down there and found her a few weeks before the holiday, but they didn't tell me until that morning. Sarah said that she was really scared that Helen and Tracy would accidentally tell the secret a couple of times during the rest of our holiday. Harry and his 2 children stayed with us in the caravan. Despite some speculation, Harry and I didn't engage in any romantic involvement right away. Our bond goes way back to our childhood, and now as adults we're taking the time to deepen our connection while there's potential for something more between us. Only time will tell whether there's romance in the air, but I'm hopeful and I sense my children share that sentiment too. The signs seemed promising to maximize our time together. Everyone, including Harry's children, made an effort to give us space in Weymouth. As our holiday drew to a close, Ralph and Sarah took Tracy and Helen with them, while I drove Harry and her 2 children back to Bath. Life went on. In April 2006, after a series of trips up and down the M4 motorway over the next 6 months, Harry and her 2 children, Russell and CLA, finally moved in with me. Shortly after the move, we encountered a minor hiccup when Helen and Tracy began calling Harry Mom and referring to their own mother as Stelma, despite Harry and I trying to discourage it. The girls tried to get Harry to respond by calling her Mom, but it didn't work because they had the backing of Harry's kids, Russell and CLA, who would repeat whatever Helen and Tracy said. So, whenever Harry responded, she was answering to Helen or Tracy as well. I have to admit it took some adjusting, and Thma wasn't pleased to say the least. I'm not sure what happened between Thma and the girls, but eventually she gave in to their wishes. Harry suggested that the girls threatened to cut. I was surprised by how hostile the girls were towards Thelma. It seemed to get worse as they got older. Then one day Harry told me that my daughters realized what had nearly happened to them and understood why those social workers and police officers had asked all those seemingly trivial questions. Harry and I eventually tied the knot, not hastily, but in a quiet ceremony in Bermuda. It was a one-of-a-kind experience with local witnesses, and we kept our plans under wraps. It's pretty amazing how long Harry managed to wear the spare ring without anyone noticing. Over time, Thelma's mental health took a turn for the worse. Her poor choice in partners and circumstances didn't help. Despite her struggles, she was coherent enough to attend her daughter Tracy's wedding to her stepbrother Russell. She looked healthier than she had in years, accompanied by her father. Unfortunately, her father passed away a few months later. Thelma was committed by her brother. She now lives in a private clinic, which is expensive. It's a burden for her brother and me, but I feel I have to care for my children's mother. Harry and I are happy with our relationship with our children. They're grown up now, so we spend most of our time at our cottage near Watford. We enjoy walking along the same paths we walked as kids. Sometimes we're joined by our grandchildren. Life goes on.